In her well-known study, Imagining the Balkans, Maria Todorova has mapped out such Balkanisms in ways that she sees as homologous to, but different from, Edward Said's well-known mechanism of Orientalism. She discerns what she terms a nesting Orientalism within Balkanism itself, particularly in the nationalist discourse surrounding the demise of the former Yugoslavia. Todorova's more recent work analyzes what she calls the belatedness associated with the Balkans that will be familiar to post-colonial theorists. These tropes are very visible in Olivia Manning's Balkans, which are peopled by venal aristocrats and primitive peasants, and it is instructive to see how the corruption of Romania is so-called corruption of Romania is juxtaposed with the inherent nobility of Greece in the final volume, comprising Byronic English Hellenophilism. Here, the classical portraits of warrior sacrifices remain exemplary reference points for the current warfare. So once the protagonists in this trilogy move to Greece, it's a very different story from being in Romania with these terrible melons, right, and peasants. In addition, the figure of the so-called cosmopolitan Jew makes an interesting and troubling appearance weaves itself through the trilogy. But have such perspectives, this was in the mid-60s, right, of the English ecology of belonging, as Gilroy would call it, changed in current British writing by those who are imagining the stranger. Remember that, like much of the European Union, there's been the problem of Eastern European migration, right? Including in England, including probably everywhere, right? Neil Acherson's recent perceptive review of the novelist Rose Tremaine's book, The Road Home, alerted me to this text. For all its moving evocation of what it means to be a stranger in Britain, Acherson points out that the protagonist, who is called Lev, is denied a homeland. As he dryly puts it, quote, "There is no such place as Eastern Europe." Lev remains a generic device to expose the shallowness and corruption of London, as reveling in abjection that is also usually a form of narcissism. This is how the novel's logic runs. England is currently a capitalist promised land for economic migrants from Eastern Europe, whose recent mobility is ensured by the EU. Yes, they suffer, but eventually they return to their benighted countries and set up entrepreneurial projects that start them down the road to a better life. What I'd like to add is that the so-called civilizing mission that we're familiar with from post-colonial writing is never far away, as in the following passage where Lev is talking to a compatriot who is also a translator. I hope, again, this comes across. "What did you say?" said Lev. "Oh, just quoting from Hamlet." "Hamlet is talking to the gravemaker, yes?" "Yes, absolutely. Where did you learn that, Lev?" Lev, standing in the sunlight, knew there was a smile on his face. Not only had he recognized the line, but now he felt as if he'd suddenly understood why Lydia had given him the play to read. She wanted to show him that words written long, long ago could travel beside you and help you at moments when you could no longer see the road. So Shakespeare, a sacred text. Right? Clearly, Lev's knowledge of Shakespeare means that he deserves to be helped to clamber out of abjection, as he does by the end of the novel. But you can see underneath this, or surrounding the framework, is again that civilizing mission. Some of them, a few, are chosen within that context to be civilized. Right? It works on them. Not all. My other example in this section is somewhat unexpected. An Indian author writing an English text set in Bulgaria. The protagonist of Rana Das Gupta's Solo, his book Solo, is 100-year-old Ulrich, who studied chemistry in Germany and returned to Bulgaria to build the communist dream, only to become mired in Todor Zhivkov's state totalitarianism. Because Ulrich is blind, the text foregrounds acoustic detail. Focusing on this sense gives the novel a promising, disorienting dimension. It also paves the way for the second half of the text that moves from rural Bulgaria to New York and the world music industry. The novel traces the adventures of a musical genius, Boris, who emerges from the unlikely context of a rural ghost town in Bulgaria to be snapped up by a New York entrepreneur who specializes in world music. Eventually, Boris's life converges with those of Katuna and her brother Irakli, refugees from the Russian mafia in Tbilisi. Boris encounters Ulrich as the latter daydreams that he has found his lost son, whose mother took him to the USA. Ultimately, however, like Tremaine's Lev, Dasgupta's characters function predominantly to expose the parallel corruptions of the Soviet and capitalist worlds. Dasgupta's corrupt and amoral New York is a mirror image of Tremaine's London, and his tale relies too much on the stereotypes associated with Eastern Europe, the fabulous folk music, leavened by so-called gypsy influences, the Russian and local mafia, rather than dwelling on the small negotiations of everyday sociality that appear to be its promise in the text's first half. Okay, so now it's the second one. Imagining oneself as stranger. So I begin, as I mentioned earlier, with the writer Christos Tsiolkas and his novel Dead Europe. By the way, Christos has been shortlisted for the Booker Man Prize. I think he didn't make the short list, but he was on the long short list. So he's really reached kind of transnational reputation. The title of this earlier text, called Dead Europe, is a telling one, and to some degree works as injunction, the fervent wish for Europe to be dead, to stop being a haunting presence and history in diasporic relations in particular. In this disturbing text, the narrator, a young Greek Australian, takes the familiar rite of passage journey back to the old culture, Europe in general, and discovers there a defining anti-Semitism that he realizes has served to profoundly shape his formation in Australia as a queer ethnic male. While on the one hand, he understands anti-Semitism's corrosive effects, he also finds that he cannot free himself of its continuing legacy, as exemplified in the following extract, which is set in Venice, which is obviously why I felt I had to include it. And I quote, "In my time in Venice, I did not watch the sunset from Harry's Bar. I did not visit the Guggenheim. I did not have tea at a palazzo or take a ferry to the Lido. I did not feed the pigeons in San Marco Square, nor did I travel on a gondola. I did not eat seafood in a restaurant overlooking the Grand Canal. I did not step inside any basilicas or cathedrals. I saw no great paintings by Titian or Tiepolo. Instead, I visited the ghetto and I drank coffee at the Café Beirut. I saw swastikas washed by the rain, and I looked into the wretched face of a despairing man and saw the ceaseless misery in his eyes and, yes, an eternal, exhausting vengeance. The hatred in his eyes was fierce and passionate. They demanded something of me and they promised no forgiveness. I wanted to forget those eyes, to never look into such eyes again. For one deranged, terrifying moment, and I promise, only a moment, it passed, I willed it away immediately. I wished that not one Jew had ever walked on the face of the earth." It's quite an astounding passage. The narrator morphs into a vengeful vampire with the suggestion that he is a figure of retribution preying on European imperial and colonial guilt, but there is increasingly no redeeming quality to his murderous onslaughts, except that their excesses exemplify the irrational excesses of the originating European legacy of anti-Semitism. The text is also further complicated by the fact that the narrator is queer, and there is an unsettling element of homoeroticism that characterizes the violence throughout. On one level, Tsiolkas' story could be seen as a deeply moral allegory, and indeed such motives have also been traced by cultural critics analyzing the vampire motive in general. But on another level, the text also exemplifies the horrifying dystopian possibilities that occur when cultural guilt is generationally transmitted and fertilized by the atrocities that characterize the colonization of the so-called New World. Tsiolkas' novel and his other work draws clear links between the treatment of indigenous peoples and the racist histories of the settler colonizers, the settler colonizers imported and acted out in the new terrain. Nor does Chalkers exonerate the later immigrants, for all that they are able to point to their own oppressions and histories of racism in the settler colony. This too is a form of the new critical cosmopolitanism rewritten from the margins, in which contamination is not necessarily a benign process leading to greater tolerance. Chalkers' vampiric legacy forms a stark contrast to the kind of benevolent contamination, the model set out by Anthony Kwame Appiah in his celebration of cosmopolitanism, somewhat reminiscent of the elitist cosmopolitanism of an earlier era. But the dead Europe portrayed in Chalkers' novel is also one where the revenge of the East is exacted in the West, or the heartland of Europe, in ways that recall some of the ideologies associated with Bram Stoker's novel Dracula. Count Dracula buying up real estate and infecting the flower of English womanhood with his poison cure bloodline, offering eternal life so long as you become a member of his tribe, is of course easily converted into numerous allegories, for example, ethnic absolutism. The argument has been made that Irishman Bram Stoker was belatedly indicting Britain's colonial history, where Ireland might be said to figure as Britain's first colony. Interestingly, that text also invokes a deep-seated religiosity, as does Chalkers' text, even though theoretically both of them reference an oppositional domain, the Antichrist, damnation, etc. Dead Europe ends with the protagonist's mother back in Australia weeping outside the church that had previously been her refuge, in ways that ethnic churches have long offered comfort to diasporic communities. Her excommunication occurs because she takes responsibilities for importing the prejudices and racisms of the so-called old country to the new. This meant that she was now among the damned. Chalkers' narrator imagines himself a stranger in both the European context as well as the homeland of Australia. My next example also has problems in locating home. And I cite from her, enigmatically, "If Amsterdam was a stage, I had a double role. I was both audience and performer, watcher and watched." Dubravka Ugresic are you familiar with her work at all? No, okay. Is a writer with a captivatingly sardonic point of view that serves, amongst other things, to depict a world that has been pulled away from under her. It is a work that fiercely satirizes what she calls ostalgia, in which exiles from Eastern Europe recreate small pockets of their former lives in the midst of the affluent so-called West, but also depicts the utopian pathos of a Yugoslav elementary school primer that no longer has a state to educate. This Yugostalgia acquires more sinister connotations in Ugresic's novel called The Ministry of Pain, where what begins as a memory game to recover the everyday textures of a former society blossoms into fully fledged trauma and requires stringent attempts to exorcise its aftermath. At the same time that she recreates with fidelity a world that no longer exists, Ugresic also writes about the new globalization. Within Europe, the former Eastern Europeans find their place as cleaning ladies. The narrator obeys the stereotypes, noting that, to cite her, "My cosmopolitan countrywomen are known far and wide as excellent housekeepers in European Union apartments, houses, and public lavatories." Their newly partitioned countries occupy another set of carefully mapped locations while they await coveted inclusion in the EU, to quote from her. And this is her book called Nobody's Home. It's a collection of essays. "It is no easy matter being a small nation. How does one even know where to begin? That must be why the first thing that occurs to the member is to orientate himself in time. And there, just beyond the impenetrable bulwark, you can hear the snorting of horses and the frustrated howls of the barbarians, trying unsuccessfully to invade from the east." It is also the case that Ugresic could be seen as self-balkanizing in ways that others have mapped self-orientalizing, that is, an internalization of abjection.